Welcome to AEC Leadership Today, the podcast designed exclusively for engineering, architecture, and construction industry leaders who want to stay relevant and effective. The show takes on the most pressing issues facing the AEC industry and was created to help you and your firm grow and prosper in the 21st century. The host of AEC Leadership Today is Pete Atherton, a professional engineer and former AEC principal and owner turned AEC coach and consultant. And now, take a break from your never-ending to-do list and welcome Peter Atherton.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another great episode of AEC Leadership Today. Today is a first here on the podcast. There will be three of us, plus, of course, all of you. And we'll be speaking with Dale Crow, a professional liability and risk management attorney and senior vice president at Risk Strategies, a return guest to the podcast, and Rob Rosenzweig, the national cyber risk practice leader, serving across industries and market sectors, and who's also a senior vice president at Risk Strategies. And we'll be talking about digital and cyber risks and strategies for better security. Welcome to the podcast, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, glad to be here.
All right. Well, we have a lot of ground to cover, so let's just dig right in. Maybe Dale, beginning with you, can you share a little bit about you, your career, and what you focus on today in terms of our industry and cyber risk and security?
Absolutely. I jokingly say I'm a recovering attorney. I spent about 10 years in Nashville, Tennessee, litigating claims primarily against architects and engineers. So we did a lot of contractual negotiations and issues as well. But that's been a background of mine. After spending about 10 years doing that, then I moved over to the lovely world of insurance. And the beauty of it is that, you know, in that prior life, when I was called in, it was usually after something had gone wrong, right? And now I get to use that experience in seeing those things that went wrong to try to educate and prepare our clients to avoid and mitigate what risks they can in design and construction. And although I'm a trained professional liability attorney, you know, in the environment in which we all operate now, cybersecurity, cyber liability has become a big part of what we do, which is exactly why when I was lucky enough for you to reach out about joining you again, I thought it'd be a great idea to bring in Rob, who is the chair of our national cyber practice.
All right. Well, with that, Rob, can you share a little bit about your background in cyber and how you interface with the AEC industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So my career has entirely been in the world of insurance. So unlike my colleague Dale, not a recovering attorney myself. You know, my background in the insurance industry, which has been going on 15 years now, has been entirely in what we would call the financial line sector of insurance. So that's the broader product suite that covers risks emanating from professional liability, cyber risk, technology, as well as management liability directors and officers and employment practices. You know, not surprisingly, you know, the risks we talk about today when we say cyber really were born out of the onset of technology in the early aughts and the Y2K fear. So, you know, that's been an area of focus of mine my entire career, but certainly as technology has become more prevalent across all industries, the reality of the risks our clients are facing has become more prevalent across all industry sectors and clients of all size, and specific to, you know, partnering with Dale and other colleagues within our professional services practices. You know, while architects and engineers and other professional services firms don't necessarily have a wealth of personal identifiable information, they, like other industries, have become extremely reliant on technology and are also an attractive target for cyber criminals. So we regularly work with Dale and others within our professional services practice just to make sure our clients understand the landscape they're dealing with, doing all the right things to the extent you can to reduce the probability of having an incident, but ultimately working with our clients to get the right solutions in place to get them the insurance coverage they need to fund the investigation and response to any sort of data security incidents.
Well, great. Well, I can't wait to dig into a lot of what you just mentioned. But as we begin, maybe we can start with you, Rob. From your perspective, how has the digital threat landscape changed? And maybe in general over the last few years, but in particular, maybe over the last year and with COVID?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a few things to unpack here. One of which isn't necessarily related to COVID, but I think COVID has probably exacerbated it. So, when you think about the world of cyber criminals, this is, you have some state-sponsored groups, but this is something that organized crime is heavily involved in. So you have to keep in mind, at the end of the day, the reason they're trying to gain access to the systems and data of legitimate businesses and private individuals is because they want to monetize that level of access to return a profit, right? Their investment is whatever they're doing to gain access to our systems. They want to profit on that investment, get a return there. If we were having this conversation 5-6 years ago, the majority of the schemes that cyber criminals were executing involved targeting companies that had significant amounts of personal identifiable information, whether that be names, social security numbers, credit card numbers, or in the case of PHI, personal health information, because they could steal that information and they could sell it on the black market or the dark web for a significant profit. As things have changed, right? We've gotten better at responding to those types of incidents. So think about, in your own personal life, if your credit card number is stolen, you call Amex, you call your bank, you get a new credit card in 24 hours and they back out those fraudulent transactions. So the value of that type of data for a criminal that wants to rack up fraudulent transactions has diminished. So cyber criminals had to evolve and think about another way of monetizing their level of access. And that's where we saw a shift in the last couple of years to ransomware becoming by far and away the most prevalent type of attack. And for those of you in the audience listening today or whenever you're catching this podcast that aren't familiar with what ransomware means or what it does at a high level, it is a type of malware that cyber criminals are able to execute on a targeted company's network that encrypts your data and systems that you're reliant upon, and then the criminals extort the affected organization for a large sum of money in exchange for giving you an encryption key to regain access to your data and your systems. So going back to my comment at the top about how this has become increasingly relevant for professional services firms and architects and engineers in particular, you don't have a lot of information, but you are reliant on systems and you do have designs and other data that are housed on those systems that you need in order to do what you do for your clients. So this type of crime has really kind of expanded the attack surface for cyber criminals. So instead of just going after big box retail, healthcare, financial services firms, this has kind of opened up the realm of we can go after any business because any business would readily pay us a significant ransom demand to regain access to their system. So that changed the landscape quite a bit. And also changed the dollars associated with the types of cybercrime we're seeing. With respect to COVID, I think there's a couple things there. I mean, one, obviously everybody switched to this remote working environment pretty rapidly, about a year ago, last week. And some companies did it well, some companies didn't do it so well. So the companies that did it well, I think the technology was sound and there wasn't any increased vulnerability. But if you didn't have that remote access, the ability to VPN back into companies' networks set up securely, that did leave some holes that cyber criminals could exploit. But I think the more pressing piece of it, which still holds some water and we're still seeing cyber criminals make hay with 12 months later, is some of what our clients have done over the last few years in implementing the right risk management practices. And I'm not talking about technology solutions. I'm talking about people and processes, how you train your employees and what your procedures are to prevent cybercrime. Hasn't worked as well when your workforce is distributed as it is when your workforce is on site, right? So questioning everything. I got an email from Dale. Did it actually come from Dale? Well, if we were in the same office, I'd walk down the hall and say, hey, Dale, did you send me this? Is this link legitimate? Did you actually want me to wire $100,000 out the door to X, Y, and Z? Well, when we're not all together, sometimes those basic steps, that validation, that secondary authentication isn't happening. And when you layer on top of that, people using their own personal devices, the technology not necessarily being deployed correctly, and dogs barking and kids screaming doing remote learning, you make it a lot easier for cyber criminals to exploit vulnerabilities.
Well, thank you. That is a tremendous summary of the landscape as far as threats, and really articulating how today is different, with the different targets. I mean, Dale, for you, what you see day in and day out with the AE industry, what do you see as far as, is it just large firms? Is it small firms? Is it just ransomware? I mean, what do you see sort of directly within the industry?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the AEC exposure is really no different than any other company, right? In terms of the types of events we're seeing, lots of ransomware, invoice manipulation, those sorts of things. And I think we'll talk a little more in detail. But, and I think you and I have talked about this offline before, I continue to believe that for the most part, the AEC community is viewed more as a conduit to the larger type institutions that have more of that information that the criminals are trying to gain. To answer your question about the size of firm, all over the board, right? From some of the largest clients that we represent to some of the smallest, and really everything in between. And perhaps it's just anecdotal, but I don't think, I think Rob and his team and what he said proves that it's not. But when we all went home in March, I felt like everything elevated. It was just more and more people reaching out to me saying, we can't access our system. We've got some type of ransomware demand. We've got this or we've got that issue. And so I think companies of all sizes and firms in the AEC world of all sizes are dealing with it. And again, I think thinking about it as well, if we want to go after this, multinational, enormous corporation, they're going to have all these sophisticated, very expensive systems. They're going to be hard to penetrate. There are going to be a lot of people, watching the bank, so to speak. And I think there is this perceived notion anyway, and I think in some sense correct by the wrongdoers here, the bad actors, that a smaller engineering firm in wherever, any town USA, who happens to be performing professional services for one of these larger entities and might be housing certain information from that entity related to the project or financial components or PII, whatever it could be. That's an easier way for us to gain access to the more sophisticated, higher cost defended entity that we're ultimately trying to gain. And so I think, one of the questions becomes, do these large owners, think of them as owners who are buying A&E services, when they begin their thoughts of selecting a consultant for their project, is one of their sort of selection process criteria, what kind of protections does this firm have in place to safeguard what we're going to be sharing with them, whether it's a healthcare project or transportation, a water treatment system. You can think of all the types of projects that would be potentially a higher risk target, if you will. So that's what I wonder. We see more and more contracts requiring our clients to carry cyber liability coverage, but it's still percentage-wise, it's a small percentage anyway that I see. But I do wonder, as things continue, will the buyers of those services start deciding in some part who they choose by how well they believe their information will be protected?
Well, I want to get into some of that, including the mechanics of what it looks like when we've been penetrated. But before we get into that, maybe just to drill down, you had mentioned invoice manipulation. Is that the software engineering? And just kind of quickly, how prevalent is that, with more electronic payments happening and not just writing checks and sending them in the mail? Is that from cyber protection perspective, should we be as concerned with that, or just it's on the radar with ransomware being number one, but we've really got to focus on the software engineering?
No, so I think of it as not really. I mean, Rob can tell me if I get wrong here, but I think of social engineering as a little different than invoice manipulation. Okay. And what I have seen happen, I mean, dozen or more times in the last year is a situation where an engineering client is sending out its invoice, right, every 30 days to be paid, and it's not being paid. And 90 days go by, for example, and the engineering firm reaches out to its client and says, hey, you haven't paid our last 3 invoices. What's up? And the buyer of those services says, no, we have. We've paid every single invoice you sent. What do you mean? And then we come to find out, well, guess what? The actual invoice that was being sent to the buyer, so to speak, the routing information, for example, to transfer the funds has been manipulated and changed. And so the last 3, in my hypothetical, the last 3 30-day invoices were paid to a criminal. So yes, I mean, that is something that we definitely are seeing. And then it becomes an issue, right, of, well, is it on our end, or our client's end, or is the issue on the buyer of the services end? And, and I think, frankly, that's when firms need to get really buckled down, get their carrier and broker involved. It is so easy for you to rely, especially a smaller firm. I will just say, I don't mean to suggest that smaller firms don't get the same type of support that a large firm does from an IT point of view. But it is somewhat easy, and I've seen this happen to where for the AE firm to say, look, our IT folks say we're fine. We haven't. There's no problem. This is on your end, and it's not always that simple. In fact, through my experience, it hasn't been that simple yet. I'm sure there's got to be a simple one out there, but I bring Rob all the tough ones. But so it's really my suggestion, based on what I've seen, for those of listening and thinking about being proactive, is if you find yourself in that situation where all we know is we haven't been paid and they're saying they've been paying us, you really need to activate your cyber liability coverage and your carrier and to find out exactly what's happened and to see if you have been penetrated or infiltrated. But that is a very common thing we are seeing. I'm sure Rob's seeing that in other lines, but that's something in the AE world that I've seen several times.
Right. Well, one question on that before we get into some of the mechanics. What the penetration, is it mostly through VPNs or kind of the private perimeter systems that are around a firm? Do you see any trends? Is it coming through all the third-party software systems that we have to download and use for our work, the Zoom, the MS Teams, and other software systems? I mean, is there any trends that you see on where the penetrations are happening?
I mean, I'll let Rob speak to that. My anecdotal experience with the claim events I've handled is a lot of it is your best and first line of defense is your people, and it's coming in through an email phishing type of attack. There may be a better technical word, but that, to me, that's what I've seen, where we saw recently where somehow through an email penetration, they were able to change a rule in the Outlook to where the email would be redirected, and the firm didn't even know about it. I mean, they had no idea about it. Their IT vendor had no idea about it until this was happening. So my experience tells me email. I don't know if Rob has anything to add to that, but that's what I've seen.
I mean, I think it depends to a degree on the criminal group you're dealing with and the type of attack that they're trying to perpetrate. But, if we're talking specifically about this sort of invoice manipulation scheme, if that's their goal is to find some sort of financial data and divert a transaction and step in between, 9 times out of 10, Dale's right. It's an employee. It's as simple as somebody getting an email that they think is legitimate, prompting them to put in their username and password. They think they're logging into, Office 365 in their web browser, or they think they're getting a DocuSign email. They key in their username and password, and you've just given the bad guys the keys to the castle. And what Dale said is exactly what they do. Not only are they monitoring traffic to see who you correspond with, what types of transactions, communications you're involved in, and then when they can step in, but they implement rules so that if somebody calls into question the email that they've received from you, that never makes its way into your inbox. That's going to an account that the criminal is monitoring themselves.
Well, interesting.
So much. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to speak over you. That's so much. I think of so many that the ones I've seen, and it's easy, right, for somebody in my position to say, well, you could have avoided this by doing that. And no one likes to be, preached at. But what I've seen, a lot of those things could have been avoided with a phone call, right? With some type of verbal confirmation or authorization. But it kind of goes back to what Rob was saying at the outset. Like we're so reliant on technology. It's a fast-paced business environment. We're texting and emailing from our phones 1,000 miles an hour, and everyone's busy. And I get it. So it's certainly reasonable to think that we will have more of those situations where it could have been avoided by some type of verbal confirmation. But some of my firms who have experienced this have put in place certain protocols with their clients, where at least they feel they put in writing somewhere early in the process that no routing information, for example, will change without a verbal discussion, without some type of confirming discussion. And I think that's a good step in the right direction.
Well, if we can, I'd love to walk through what a materialized attack looks like. I mean, with that ransomware being sort of the number one problem out there that you see, I mean, maybe Rob, can you walk us through? I mean, how if there's been a compromise, how does the business find out that there's been that they've been compromised and that someone wants something from them, or they want to sell them this encrypted key? From the time that they find out, what does finding out look like, and then all the way until maybe they're hopefully back online? Can you kind of walk us through sort of a scenario, a common scenario you see?
Yeah, certainly at a high level, and obviously there's degrees of this, right? But the most common way it becomes apparent is users don't have any access to systems that they're reliant on. So your users aren't getting email, and your IT team goes to check, wait, why is the email server down? Okay, now we think we have a problem. It all depends on the type of ransomware variant that we're dealing with, how many servers, devices on the network have been impacted by it. But it is, to a degree, what you see in the movies, right? Somebody signs on and you got a big scary message on your computer, and there's literally nothing you can do to data that might be in databases that you're reliant upon for applications that you use, or files on your file server that just have been encrypted, and you try to open them and you can't do anything with that data. Typically, these criminal groups are reaching out through some means to express what their extortion demand is. The part of the value in having an insurance policy and ultimately an incident response plan in place is that also comes with access to the expert team of vendors that can deal with the investigation and response and be a resource for your firm. So that's highly specialized legal counsel that does nothing but this, and forensic investigative response firms that also do nothing but investigate these types of incidents. And there's a number of factors, right? I mean, these ransomware variants, they see enough of the same strain and the same criminal groups at play that they know who they can negotiate with, who might be bluffing, who isn't bluffing. So there's often a back and forth to see whether we can get that ransom demand, which might start at a few $1 million, down to something that's a little bit more palatable. In some cases, it might be a ransomware variant that the forensic investigative response firms have figured out how to decrypt without having a need to pay the extortion demand. In some cases, and this is some of the things we focus on with our clients from a risk management perspective, if you're doing regular backups of your data and that those backups are stored off-site where they can't be impacted by the ransomware, maybe you don't need to pay the ransom demand, because we could just restore our data from a backup we took yesterday that we're confident is clean and isn't impacted by the ransomware. So there's degrees of how this can kind of transpire. I would say, based on, unfortunately, the efficacy of the ransomware variants that are out there, the vast majority of time our clients are forced to pay because backups are usually encrypted as well. The outages that our clients are dealing with can, at a minimum, I would say would be a week, couple weeks, sometimes have downstream implications that last far longer than that in terms of data that can't be restored and needs to be replaced. But the other scary piece of this, and this is sort of a recent change over the last couple of quarters, not only are most of our clients forced to pay, not only are the ransom demands higher, multi-million dollars, but in the vast majority of incidents, the criminals are actually making a second ransom demand on their way out the door, regardless of whether or not you paid the ransom demand to decrypt your data. They're actually taking your data and saying, well, thanks for paying us to decrypt your data. We actually also took your information, and if you don't pay us a second ransom, we're going to publish all your sensitive data on the internet. So,
well, that sounds great. So the double dipping of the criminals. It's sort of unseemly and sort of unspoken about in a lot of circles. I mean, you hear about people paying a ransom and firms having to pay ransom, insurance companies paying ransom. What does that look like? Well, I guess first of all, how is it truly a lot more pervasive than we talk about? And what are the mechanisms for doing that? Is that Bitcoin? Is it cash? What does that look like?
It is unfortunately as pervasive and probably more pervasive than anybody realizes. I mean, this is such a, not to get into the weeds on the insurance side of things, but the insurance market has gone into turmoil over the last couple quarters, where insurance carriers that are writing cyber liability insurance are scaling back the breadth of coverage. They're reducing the limits that they're willing to offer, and they're looking for rate increases in the 30 to 40% range. And there are other reasons, but the main correlation there is the impact that ransomware is having on the profitability of their business. In terms of the mechanics of payment, a lot of nuances there that we can get into if we want to, but at a minimum, I would say this: it is typically Bitcoin or some sort of other digital currency. Ransom demands on average are closing in on 300K, but I would say anecdotally we're rarely seeing ransom demands that are less than seven figures, and in some cases they're multi-million dollars. And with, I don't know how familiar you are with Bitcoin, but if any one of us wanted to, even if you had $2 million cash and that was the ransom demand, you wouldn't be able to acquire $2 million Bitcoin worth of Bitcoin in 24, 48, 72 hours. So the same forensic IR firms and other partners that they have readily at their disposal have Bitcoin wallets. So if you decide it is prudent and you do want to go ahead and make that payment, there are ways to get access to that amount of digital currency as quickly as you need to.
Yeah, so it's a whole new world. In addition, we can't do our work right now.
We don't need to get into it in detail unless you'd like to. But the only other thing I would say is, obviously, beyond the morality of this issue, there's some questions of legality when you're paying a criminal group that could be on governmental watch lists like OFAC. So there's a whole nother wrinkle there, right? A lot of these cyber criminal groups are state-sponsored groups that might be sponsored by Iran, North Korea, China. And if any of these groups are potentially on a governmental watch list, even if you want to pay them, you might not legally be allowed to pay them, nor receive a reimbursement from your insurance carrier to do so. So there's a lot of compliance work and logistics that need to go into this process, and obviously speed is of the essence because you can't access your data while this is all happening. So that's where the value and why it's so critically important to have the right response vendors that are part of this process.
Right. And I want to talk about the mitigation and the minimization of some of these risks. But before we do that, Dale, from your perspective, I mean, how pervasive are you seeing things in the AE industry with firms paying the ransom and having the tools through their insurance to be able to sort of work through that process? Or if they don't have it, you've seen stories of, or heard of firms that didn't have the insurance, and how do you deal at this point?
Yeah, I think of the cyber liability insurance as a really service-driven insurance because it's so highly technical. I mean, I know, just this, and I deal with it almost every other day, though I wish I didn't. But, having that entity, that carrier, that team of forensics, that breach coach, having that team to call when you walk in on Monday morning and the entire system's down. And for whatever reasons, it only happens to my clients over the weekend. I don't know if that's written in the code somewhere, but it does feel that way. That you know who to activate, and with a single email or a single phone call, you trigger this team to jump in and support you. And I agree with Rob. I mean, it's funny. I feel like 3 to 5 years ago, the ransomware demands were far smaller than they are now. At least that's what I've seen from my clients. And my thought then was, well, they're almost coming up with a nuisance value, right? Just easier to pay $10,000 than it is to go through this process of figuring it all out and perhaps not turning over the data or not paying the ransom. But those numbers have gone up, and I think it has made what I've seen the firms and the carriers look at that harder, not to mention all the issues that Rob brings up about, the legality of being able to make those payments. So if you don't have a carrier, right, if you don't have a sophisticated team let me put it this way. If you don't have your own internal sophisticated team that could help you obtain the digital currency and do all those things, then you're at the criminals. I mean, you're at their feet, and they're going to be able to do whatever they want to. So having the insurance as a backstop and have all these service providers is really important. And so I don't think in that regard the AEC community is very different from a lot of others.
But as you're sort of facing directly into the AEC world, I mean, are you seeing this ransomware, and there's ransoms being paid?
Absolutely. But, nobody wants to talk about it, and no one's putting it up on LinkedIn. Right. So, with understandably, I mean, again, I have started to think of security for A&E firms as a competitive advantage. I mean, and it's that sort of thing. Would you want it to get out? And we all know, right? I mean, we know that the criminals are pretty much one step ahead of us, at least from what I've seen. So it's not necessarily a knock on your firm that you had some type of breach event. I mean, that's not always the case. Perhaps it might have revealed, some things you needed to change, but in and of itself, it's not necessarily means you're not doing something right. But at the same time, who wants, in this day and age, with everyone being so focused on cybersecurity, what kind of AEC wants a potential client to hear about this massive breach where potentially all of their information was accessed? No one. So it leads to a more secretive or less publicized type of event.
Right. Well, let's get into the risk mitigation of the threat minimization and risk mitigation. Rob, with insurance costs going up and maybe even coverage hardening, if you will. I mean, are there sort of minimum controls now necessary to be able to access this type of insurance? I mean, what are you seeing as far as are there sort of the minimum thresholds? You have to be doing this in order to be insured, or even if you can get insurance, what are some of those best practices to sort of minimize your risk of breach?
Yeah, more and more that is becoming the reality. And even if it's not the threshold for where you can get insurance or not, you can be certain your costs are going to be significantly higher if you're not doing what have come to be viewed as sort of the baseline controls. And as coverage continues to pull back a little bit as well, carriers are also putting other restrictive provisions in the policy where if you're not doing certain things from a risk management perspective, maybe the claim won't get paid or there's less dollars available to pay that claim. Examples of a few things that I sort of focus on with our clients and view as table stakes in the current climate that we're living in is having multi-factor authentication enabled across your network. And that means not just to access email, but any applications to VPN into the network, you need to have multi-factor authentication for all users. We talked about this being really a people issue at its core. So the companies that are focusing on employee security awareness training and regularly phishing their own employees with fake phishing emails have proved to be more resilient in dealing with these types of incidents. I mentioned backups when talking about ransomware, right? The easiest way to deal with this and not have to pay the ransom demand is for it to be a non-factor. So if you have backups that are regularly taken and they're stored offline and air gapped from the internet, they're not going to be vulnerable to be encrypted by these threat actors. So that's a panacea to a degree there. And, you know, I think beyond that, you know, the other thing I would tend to focus on with our clients is the incident response process, right? So I think there is some comfort that underwriters take in understanding that your company has the right culture, you understand how severe this issue is, and you've done the right things both in terms of risk mitigation, but also when it does happen, here's how we know how to escalate it and who's going to be involved in the incident response process, because that means at the end of the day, it's going to be less dollars going out the door and less reputational impact to your business. And I know I said that was the last thing, but now I really would add one other point in that. Well, actually, I'll leave it there. I'll hand it over to Dale if he has anything to say.
I'll cover for him.
Right. And well, I guess in that sense, I mean, it's obviously an IT issue to some degree, right? But this is the business. And so I guess, Dale, from your perspective, working with firms, has it reached the board level? Is it a priority of the CEO or the COO working with IT? I mean, how do you see that interplay with dealing with these sort of complex issues that go beyond, you know, is our system reliable and faster?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially with the larger AEC firms, the CIO or the equivalent, right, the information officer, that individual has a seat at the table. I mean, you know, they are very involved in what's going on because it is I think it has reached the board level. Now, you know, there are exceptions. I mean, I meet with firms every now and then of great size and scale that don't buy the insurance. They feel for whatever reason that they're going to attack it a different way. Obviously, it's easy, I guess, to be in the insurance brokerage world and say that I disagree. But for the most part, I do disagree. And you know, we spend a lot of time. We have spent decades going into our clients' offices and training them and educating them about loss prevention, risk mitigation for professional liability claims, right? How to avoid risky projects, or what is a risky project, how to avoid certain risks on that project. And while we're not doing it to the level, certainly, that we do for the professional risk mitigation, we are spending a lot of time counseling our AE firms about this risk, about educating their people, the penetration testing type things that Rob mentioned, tabletop exercises that can be done to make sure that this is high up on everyone's radar. Because again, like we said earlier, it's affecting firms of all sizes. So, you know, and another thing I would mention is some of these confidentiality agreements. This is completely outside of the topic in terms of an attack. But we see more and more extremely onerous confidentiality requirements in contracts. And some of those, quite frankly, I can come up with several different ways that a breach of that confidentiality would not be a triggering event for a professional liability policy. So with some of these very onerous confidentiality provisions, a robust, full standalone cyber program is a way to transfer that risk as well.
Right. Well, I did want to ask you a question on how the insurance, the cyber insurance, is a little different than professional liability in that. But there is this, you know, if in the industry, and it might be other industries, but I know in our industry, if you're doing federal work, you've got to follow the CMMC, which is the cybersecurity maturity model certification, which is a higher level of security in order to work on federal projects. Are you seeing that? I mean, do you see it in other industries and in this industry? Is that a good method to follow? I mean, initially it was, oh, it's so onerous that we can't do this. But do you see that playing out as a way of, well, actually, it's good practice for you enhancing your cybersecurity risks or minimizing your risks, whether you're doing federal work or not?
Yeah, I mean, with that particular, the CMMC, and I'm not an expert on it. We've not seen it that much. I mean, my understanding, a lot of firms, when that came out initially, a lot of firms thought, well, here's a way to differentiate ourselves, right? Let's get going down that path very quickly. That'll separate us, that'll elevate us, that'll increase revenues, and make us more attractive to it was basically DoD type work. My understanding is that they haven't really even developed the assessors in any certain capacity to be able to really assess those firms, vying for that work. So, I do think whether it's a federal scheme like that, or certification of the 5 levels like is in that one, or whether it's some other one that's going to relate to healthcare. I really do think that as I said earlier, that the clients, buyers of AE services are going to be looking at those things, and I think firms, rightfully so, are going to be looking at being as far ahead of those trends and those requirements as possible, to be ready to be one of the preferred vendors who can meet that criteria to immediately get that work. So it's whether it's the CMMC or some other one. I think the thought process behind it and the competitive advantage that a firm will seek is pretty similar.
Thank you for that. How hard is it, or how easy is it to buy cybersecurity insurance? Is it just one policy and it kind of looks the same for everybody? Is there a bunch of different line item or coverage grants that you really have to know your firm, and different firms are going to have different styles and types of coverage? I guess, from maybe big picture, Rob, is there sort of a blanket generic cybersecurity, or is it very customized? And then maybe Dale, if you could add, what does that look like for AEC firms?
So unfortunately, and this is a bit of a plug for partnering with a specialty broker like ourselves, the answer is it's not an easy process. It never was an easy process, and it's only getting worse. You have 100+ insurers that are in the business of writing cyber liability insurance, and there's no consistency in policy wording from insurance carrier to insurance carrier, nor is the terminology that they might use and include in their policy wording the same from one carrier to another. So just because it says cyber liability doesn't mean that it's meeting your needs. So working with a specialty broker that really focuses on this area within the industry, knows which carriers are strong, have a track record for writing this type of coverage, paying claims, committed to being in this marketplace, is important. And when you layer on top of that landscape that we were already dealing with, the fact that the insurance marketplace has entered this challenging period in Q3, Q4 of last year, where carriers are pulling back on coverage and looking for rate increases year over year, it's even more important to make sure that the provisions that are being scaled back aren't material based on the priorities of your particular organization, and that you're working with a carrier that really has thought through sustainability in terms of the breadth of coverage that they're offering and how they're pricing that risk, so that they can be a partner for you, not just for this renewal cycle, but for 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road.
Yeah, and I would just add to that while we're so fortunate to have Rob and his team, that those types of coverage grants and bespoke policy wording, I run to him as he probably rolls his eyes. Here he comes again. But my clients, they get all the benefit of that, right? So it's a beautiful thing. But what I've picked up on, having been involved with a number of different carriers and breach response issues, is it's not unlike professional liability response, in that one differentiator that I've seen is the breach response team on the carrier side. I think some do it better than others. And kind of going back to the education component of our clients, there's a lot of moving parts in a breach response, a lot more than your average professional liability claim. So for firms that have not been through it before, Well, yeah. Well, let me say, for firms that have not been through it before, I try to get ahead of it, and get with them and explain to them, okay, here's how it's going to work, because it's not going to be Dale Crow dealing. You're not going to be dealing with me the whole time. I mean, there are going to be different entities, different companies, different law firms, forensics, maybe a PR firm, the carrier, our claims team. It can be a lot. I mean, it really can for a firm, and I don't care what size they are. If you've not been through it before, the first time you go through it, and I've seen that, blank stare, it can be a lot. So we try the best we can before that happens to sort of set their expectations and educate them about how it's going to work. But I think Rob said it earlier, and I meant to say this before. I think the most important thing that I do as a risk management partner who's not a cyber specialist with my AE firms, is to really try to impress upon them that they need their own internal process of what to do if there is an issue, right? And we will sit down and go through sort of a chart. Here's what you need to do. Now, sometimes it can be as simple as just call me and we'll flip the switch, and start the action. But I see too many firms not react quickly enough, frankly, who will just say, well, we're talking with our IT folks and we're looking into it. And it should be a really proactive reporting type situation, is my opinion. And so educating the insured, the client, on what the process will look like and what's expected of them and what they need to do. To me, that's a big part of the way I see my role.
And that's a good point with that. It's one more emergency action plan that is just good business practice to have as it relates to your data and security. Exactly. There's one other area, and this maybe Dale is tapping into your professional liability hat. And you've mentioned it before, with cyber, right? With the risks of being compromised and the work that we're doing, and that maybe we're seen as access to another one of our clients. How do you see cyber risk and minimizing those risks as something, I think is your term, the ever evolving standard of care? That, you mentioned it might be contractual. Are there things that we're going to have to protect even more because maybe the standard of care might change? I guess anecdotally, or have you seen areas, and I put it in the context of, there was not too long ago, a small Florida town water system or community or district, whatever it was, a small potable water system in Florida that was attacked, and the chemical doses were changed. Now, fortunately, somebody recognized that and changed them back. And to my knowledge, nobody was hurt. But is there a risk to a firm that might have provided that SCADA system? Another firm that might have been doing some operational help that got hacked. And so how do you, from an operational perspective or from a design perspective, if something is hacked on the inside to get information, or after the design is in place, if we didn't design certain things in place? This is a long-winded way to ask you, what do you think about, is there some threat to the standard of care evolving as it relates to cyber that would be good to be aware about and have conversations around?
Okay, short answer, yes, I think so. Long question, short answer, yes. I think to expand on that, and this is theoretical in some sense at this point. So I think that the takeaway, hard takeaway, is just, I would suggest firms keep their ear on the ground on this, right, and be very in tune to what types of projects and clients are being, are more high value targets, right? Or seeing more issues. But, we have seen weather uncertainty, active shooters, right? These sorts of things, that does move the standard of care along the way. The standard of care does evolve. It evolves, and we're looking into how will COVID change the standard of care? And certainly it will, right? So I think it's not a stretch by any sense of the imagination to think that as municipalities or, transportation groups or, whatever, these entities that are building projects, they look to the design community to give them information about what they need to produce their project, right? I mean, what is the design criteria? We have seen, I mentioned active shooter, and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but we have seen states who are looking the way they design their schools, right? We want to be prepared for this. Well, who do they go to ask how to do that? They go to the engineers, right? So, and it's, well, how should we design this building to sort of mitigate this risk? Now, while engineers are not building IT infrastructure, that's a very different thing. I do think in terms of security of systems, certainly physical security of rooms for servers and those sorts of information that could run complicated process. I think of process engineers, right, who are developing designs for various manufacturer. I think absolutely. Right, you know, if you are a design consultant who's been hired by some type of owner that is ready to design and construct what you as the designer know is a common target, I don't think it is a stretch to say that a claim could come in and they will find an engineer who will say, well, the standard of care required you to do X, Y, and Z. The beauty of this is I'm not an engineer. So by my sitting up here and opining all of this, I can't change the standard of care. So that's a good thing. So everybody can, not get mad at me, because I have seen situations in other walks of life, non-cybersecurity, where I think, we are moving the standard of care into uncharted waters. And as everyone probably knows in your audience, but just as a gentle reminder, what standard of care is the level at which you find liability, right? So, I mean, that is the minimum threshold. Hit the standard of care, or if you fall below the standard of care, you now have legal liability. So, it's a long-winded way to say I think it's an interesting topic. I don't know where it goes, but I think you're short-sighted if you don't think that we are moving in that direction.
And honestly, everything. Go ahead, Rob.
I was just going to say quickly. I mean, I think beyond the potential for increased liability, and this kind of goes back to Dale's earlier point, it's if not doing the right things, do you limit how viable you are commercially in a go-forward state? And it's not just dealing with the federal government or municipalities, but you've got other industries that are heavily regulated that not only dictate what those industries have to do, but any vendors that they use, regardless of what level of access that vendor might have, they have to adhere to the same controls. So think about financial services firms in New York State. You think about business associates of healthcare entities. The possibilities are endless, and just from a maturity standpoint, regardless of industry, you've got Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies. If those are your customers, their requirements for what vendors need to adhere to, both in terms of their risk management, but also their insurances that they purchase, are so rigid, and they're not really deviating from that regardless of what the scope of the engagement might look like. Right.
And it's just another element that, architecture firms and engineering firms, that as it relates to cyber, but really as the field evolves and how client and customer needs evolve, that we've got to stay on top of them. I mean, especially as Dale mentioned, as their professional, vendors, or their professional consultants, or people who are helping to drive strategy to protect them moving forward. Well, as we close, we could talk about this. I mean, I don't know if I want to, it's a little scary, but I mean, we could talk about this, as a way to sort of bring something to light, so we're better protected and we can better serve, our clients and society better. So I say that in jest. It scares me a little bit, but it does. But anyway, so I want to thank you for bringing this up. But I mean, as we close, I mean, is there anything that we haven't covered, or something else that you'd like to share or emphasize in order to help leaders of engineering and architecture firms really understand these cyber risks in ways that they can sort of mitigate them through different strategies?
I think I'd probably close by just saying question everything. I mean, one thing we didn't talk about is we talked about the human capital issue and your weak link sometimes being employees doing something wrong, but same concept applies to vendors that your firm itself is partnering with. So whether that be, an outside outsourced IT service firm, question what they're doing, what the level of access they have, are they using the right technologies that have been secured, but also just question everything that you do in your own dealings with your clients, how you're communicating, what you do in your personal lives. The more we're diligent about that personally and professionally, I think the better chance we have of avoiding those issues and being the weak link ourselves.
Yeah, I don't want to be repetitive. That's almost exactly what I would say. Keep understand that this is a main risk for you as an architect engineering firm, and put it high up on your radar and your level of lists of things that you're focused at the board level. Even if you don't buy it, talk to an insurance specialist who focuses on cyber liability and listen to things like this podcast and this presentation. Educate yourself on it, right? I like I said, I didn't want to learn that much about it. I'm like you, Pete. It scares me at times, but I feel like if I don't know enough to at least counsel my clients, halfway down the road before bringing in Rob, then I'm not doing my job. Because I will tell you, I have firms that have had worse cyber issues in the last year than they have any professional issue, and I mean professional liability. So that's what I would say in closing.
Great. Well, thank you. I just want to say it is alarming when this happens. I mean, I've had brute force attacks on my website, on some of my, and so it is sort of unnerving when you talk to your, folks in my IT saying, "Are we okay? Are we up?" I mean, it's all these things outside of your control, and that's just me, and that my relatively small practice. But how can listeners get in touch with you to learn more about both of you and about risk strategies?
Well, I would encourage everybody to go to our website, riskstrategies.com, and there's a knowledge center there, talks about A&E issues, talks about, of course, cyber and Rob's team. And then you know how to get a hold of me, and I'm on LinkedIn, of course, and my email address is dcrow@riskstrategies.com. So please reach out if we can be helpful in any way.
Great.
And nothing to add there.
Right. And we'll put email links to both Dale and Rob in the show notes. Well, I want to thank you both for coming on and digging into this topic, because it is high on the minds of a lot of folks. And there is, because it's talked about, but it's not really talked about in detail, in actionable detail, to really help firm leaders understand the magnitude of what we're up against, and maybe some of the strategies that are out there, and really what recourse they have to protect themselves. So I really want to thank you for opening up and sharing with us about what we can do with respect to minimizing our cyber risk.
Our pleasure. Thanks for having us.
All right. Well, look forward to seeing you again, and take care.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode of AEC Leadership Today. If you want to stay relevant and effective and take your growth and prosperity to new levels, it's time to take action. To learn more about how Pete can help take you and your firm to the next level, visit www.actionsprove.com. That's www.actionsprove.com. See you next time on the AEC Leadership Today podcast.